Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Let's talk about work. For most of us, it's a place where you try to do a good job, keep your head down, and collect your paycheck. You learn the rules, you learn the culture, and you learn who to avoid at the coffee machine. But we've all seen or experienced that one particular type of manager, haven't we? The one who acts like the company handbook is just a collection of suggestions, and that the rules that apply to everyone else, well, they just don't apply to them. They operate on whims, on ego, and on the assumption that they hold all the cards. But what happens when their target, the employee they've decided to get rid of, knows the rulebook better than they do? What happens when the person they're trying to fire illegally or unjustly has a PhD in company policy? Today, we're diving into some absolutely glorious stories of procedural revenge. These aren't tales of screaming matches or dramatic walkouts. Oh no, this is something far more satisfying. These are stories about employees who, when faced with an unjust termination, didn't just get mad, they got organized. They buried their bosses in a mountain of their own company's paperwork, and it is a sight to behold. All right, let's kick things off with a story that is the absolute gold standard of bureaucratic warfare. This one comes from a senior engineer, a guy we'll call Frank, who had been with his company for the better part of 2 decades. Frank wasn't just an employee, he was part of the furniture. He knew the systems inside and out, he'd seen managers come and go, and he was the go-to guy whenever a problem came up that had everyone else stumped. His job was secure, not just because he was good at it, but because his position was tied to a massive, long-term government contract. This wasn't just a corporate gig. It was practically a civil service position embedded within a private company, and that little detail is going to become very, very important. For 15 years, life was good. The work was challenging, the pay was solid, and the management chain mostly left him alone to do what he did best. Then came the shakeup. A new director was brought in from outside the company. Let's call him Rex. Rex was one of those guys. He walked in with a flashy suit, a blindingly white smile, and the kind of aggressive, let's trim the fat attitude that immediately puts everyone on edge. He was all about synergy, disruption, and a dozen other buzzwords he'd picked up at some weekend leadership seminar. He saw the engineering department not as a team of seasoned experts, but as a line item on a budget that needed to be optimized. From day one, Rex had it out for Frank. He couldn't understand Frank's role. In Rex's mind, an engineer who spent half his day thinking and sketching out solutions instead of frantically typing or sitting in Six Sigma meetings was a low-utility employee. He saw Frank's quiet confidence and deep institutional knowledge not as an asset, but as a threat to his authority. He wanted to bring in his own people, fresh-faced college grads who would say, "How high?" when he said, "Jump," and who would cost the company half of what Frank was making. The campaign started subtly. Frank was left out of key meetings. His project proposals were misplaced. Rex would publicly question his methods, asking for detailed justifications for processes that had been standard practice for over a decade. Frank, being the veteran he was, saw the writing on the wall. He knew Rex was trying to build a case to push him out. He updated his resume, started putting out feelers to his network, and prepared for the inevitable. The day finally came. Rex called Frank into his glass-walled office. He didn't even ask him to sit down. "Frank," Rex started, leaning back in his chair with a smug look, "we're making some structural changes in the department. As part of our new efficiency initiative, we've decided that your position is redundant. We're going to have to let you go." Frank just stood there and nodded slowly. He'd been expecting it. "Okay," he said calmly. "What's the severance package?" Rex smirked. "Well, given that this is a termination for redundancy, the standard 2-week package applies. HR will have the paperwork for you to sign on your way out." Frank felt a flicker of anger, but he kept his composure. 2 weeks, for 15 years of service. That was a slap in the face. But then, a dusty corner of his memory lit up. Something about that government contract, something about the specific hiring and firing procedures it mandated. "Actually, Rex," Frank said, his voice even, "I don't think that's the correct procedure for my position." Rex's smile faltered. "What are you talking about? It's a standard redundancy termination." "Not for me," Frank replied. "My role is a key personnel position under the federal contract number 77B 4/9. As I'm sure you're aware, any termination of key personnel for any reason has to be conducted strictly according to the procedures outlined in Appendix C of the Master Contract Agreement." Rex just stared at him, his mouth slightly agape. It was clear he had absolutely no idea what Frank was talking about. He had walked in assuming he could fire a veteran engineer like he was canceling a magazine subscription. "Appendix what?" Rex stammered. "Appendix C," Frank said, a small smile playing on his lips for the first time. "You might want to have legal pull a copy for you. It's quite detailed. I'll be at my desk continuing my duties until you initiate the process correctly. Have a good day, Rex." Frank turned and walked out, leaving his new director utterly dumbfounded. When he got back to his desk, he did a quick search on the internal network. He found the document. His heart nearly stopped. Appendix C wasn't an appendix. It was a tome. It was an 800-page standalone manual detailing every single step, sub-step, and sub-sub-step for the performance management and termination of key personnel. It was a bureaucratic monster, written by government lawyers with a sadistic love for red tape. And Frank realized Rex didn't just have to follow it, he had to master it. What followed was a masterclass in malicious compliance. The next day, Frank received a formal notice of intent to initiate termination proceedings via certified internal mail, just as step 1 of the 800-page manual required. Frank, in turn, filed a formal acknowledgement of receipt, as required by step 2. Step 3 required Rex to provide a comprehensive justification document outlining the business case for the redundancy. This couldn't be a one-page summary. The manual specified it had to be a minimum of 20 pages, including financial projections, workflow impact analysis, and a skills overlap assessment with other employees. It took Rex and 2 HR managers a full week to cobble it together. Frank received the document. Step 4 allowed him 30 calendar days to prepare a formal rebuttal. Frank used all 30 days. He wrote a 50-page counterargument, complete with charts, historical project data, and testimonials from other department heads about his value to the company. He cited his own deep knowledge of legacy systems that no one else understood, pointing out the catastrophic risks of removing him without a 1-year knowledge transfer plan. A plan which, of course, was not part of Rex's efficiency initiative. The ball was back in Rex's court. According to the manual, he now had to convene a termination review committee. This committee couldn't be just his buddies. The rules specified its composition: 1 senior manager from a different division, 1 representative from legal, 1 from HR, and 2 peer-level engineers from Frank's own department. Rex's face turned white when he realized he had to ask 2 of Frank's closest colleagues to sit on the committee that would decide his fate. The committee was formed. Their first task, as outlined in Section 12, Paragraph 4, was to spend no less than 40 man-hours reviewing both Rex's justification and Frank's rebuttal. This meant that 5 senior, highly paid employees had to spend a full week locked in a conference room, reading 100 pages of the most boring corporate prose imaginable. The process dragged on for months. Each step generated a mountain of paperwork. There were forms for everything: meeting minutes, evidence logs, witness statements. Rex had to formally document every interaction with Frank. Frank, for his part, played the role of the perfect employee. He showed up on time, did his work flawlessly, and cheerfully asked Rex for updates on the termination proceedings in the hallway. He was a ghost in the machine, a man already fired but contractually obligated to haunt the office until the paperwork said he could leave. Rex was losing his mind. His grand plan to remake the department was completely stalled. His entire focus was now on navigating this 800-page labyrinth. His own boss, the VP of engineering, started asking questions. Why was this one termination consuming so much of the director's time? Why were there so many billable hours from the legal department being charged to Rex's budget? The tipping point came around the 6-month mark. The committee, after endless deliberation, had to deliver a preliminary, non-binding recommendation. According to the manual, if the recommendation wasn't unanimous, the process had to be escalated to a corporate VP on the government contracts side. Frank's two peers on the committee, naturally, refused to recommend his termination. The process was now deadlocked, and Rex was facing the prospect of explaining his fiasco to a vice president who actually understood the contract. A week later, Frank was called into a different office. This time, it was the head of HR and a lawyer from the legal department. Rex was nowhere to be seen. The HR head looked exhausted. "Frank," she said, sliding a folder across the table, "we are prepared to offer you an enhanced severance package in exchange for your voluntary resignation, effective immediately." Frank opened the folder. It was a spectacular offer: a full year's salary, his annual bonus paid out in full, 6 months of paid health insurance, and most beautifully, a glowing letter of recommendation signed by the VP of engineering. Frank leaned back and smiled. "I accept," he said. He had never intended to stay. He just wanted to leave on his own terms, and he wanted to make sure Rex paid a price for his arrogance. By forcing the company to follow its own ridiculous, convoluted rules, he had turned a 2-week pink slip into a 6-month, high-cost legal nightmare for them and a golden parachute for himself. He had won, not by yelling or fighting, but by reading the fine print. Isn't that just a thing of beauty? It's a corporate chess match where one player thought they were playing checkers. Rex walked in with a sledgehammer, ready to smash things up, only to find out that Frank was sitting there with a rulebook so dense it could be used as a shield. What makes this story so incredibly satisfying is the sheer arrogance of the new director. He assumed his title gave him absolute power, and he couldn't be bothered to understand the landscape he was trying to conquer. Frank, on the other hand, didn't need to yell, he didn't need to argue. He just calmly pointed to the rules, the company's own rules, and said, "Follow them." He turned their bureaucracy, their own self-protective red tape that was probably designed by lawyers to prevent lawsuits, into his weapon. It's a powerful reminder that sometimes the most potent tool you have at your disposal is the knowledge your opponent is too lazy to acquire. He didn't just get a payout. He gave a masterclass in professional self-defense. Okay, so for our next story, we're shifting the perspective a little bit. This time, our hero isn't the one on the chopping block. He's the manager who's being ordered to swing the axe. It's one thing to fight for your own job, but it's another thing entirely to put your neck on the line for someone on your team. This is a story about a manager who was backed into a corner by a vindictive HR rep with a personal grudge. He was given a simple, unjust order: fire your best employee. But instead of refusing and getting fired himself, or caving and firing an innocent person, he chose a third option. He decided to comply so hard, so thoroughly, and so meticulously that the system would break the person who was trying to abuse it. Our narrator, let's call him Dave, was a mid-level manager running a small, highly effective team. And on that team there was one person who was the absolute bedrock. We'll call her Sarah. Sarah was the dream employee. She wasn't flashy, she wasn't a schmoozer, she was just incredibly good at her job. Her work was always flawless, she always hit her deadlines, and she had a knack for quietly solving problems before they became crises. She was the person Dave could always count on, the reliable engine that kept the whole department running smoothly. Dave's performance reviews were great, largely because Sarah's work made the whole team look good. Now, into this happy little ecosystem steps our villain, Brenda from HR. Brenda was the personification of every corporate nightmare. She was a bureaucrat who seemed to genuinely believe that her purpose in life was to make everyone else's life more difficult. She wielded the company policy manual like a weapon and seemed to derive a special kind of joy from catching people on minor infractions. She loved the power she had, and she had a particular dislike for people who didn't engage in her brand of office politics and gossip. Sarah, being a quiet, head down, get the work done type, had apparently committed the cardinal sin of not sufficiently sucking up to Brenda. Maybe she'd been too busy to chat by the water cooler, or maybe she had politely corrected Brenda on a small detail during a meeting once. Whatever the reason, it was clear that Brenda had put a target on Sarah's back. The whole thing came to a head one Tuesday afternoon. Dave got an email from Brenda with the subject line, "Urgent Meeting." He walked over to the HR department, assuming it was about some new corporate training initiative. He was wrong. He sat down in Brenda's sterile office, and she slid a folder across the desk with an air of grim satisfaction. "Dave," she began, "we have a problem with Sarah." Dave was confused. "A problem? What kind of problem? Her performance metrics are the highest on the team." Brenda gave a condescending little smile. "Performance isn't just about metrics, Dave. We've had some complaints. Her attitude is poor. She's not a team player. She creates a negative atmosphere." Dave was floored. This was the complete opposite of the Sarah he knew. "Who complained?" he asked. "What are the specifics?" "I'm not at liberty to disclose that," Brenda said smoothly. "Suffice it to say, the decision has been made. We need to terminate her employment." The blood drained from Dave's face. "Terminate her? Brenda, that's insane. She's my best employee. There has to be a mistake." "There's no mistake," Brenda said, her voice turning to steel. "This is a directive from HR. You need to process her termination by the end of the week." Dave pushed back. He argued, he presented Sarah's perfect performance reviews, he talked about her critical project involvement. But Brenda wouldn't budge. Finally, seeing he was getting nowhere, Dave realized the real game. This wasn't about performance, it was a personal hit job. Brenda leaned forward. "Look, Dave, you can either do this, or I can go to your director and report that you're being insubordinate and refusing to manage your personnel. How do you think that's going to look?" And there it was, the threat. Dave was trapped. If he refused, he'd be fired. If he complied, he'd be firing his best employee for no reason, destroying his team's morale and his own integrity. He sat there for a moment, his mind racing. And then he remembered the dreaded Performance Improvement Plan, or PIP. The PIP at their company was a legendary beast of bureaucracy. It was a multi-stage, ridiculously complex process so filled with paperwork and mandatory check-ins that it was designed to be a legal shield for the company, not a practical management tool. It was a maze that no one ever navigated successfully. And in that maze, Dave saw his path. He looked up at Brenda, his expression changing from defeated to determined. "Okay, Brenda, I understand. I will proceed as directed. But to ensure the company is fully protected from any potential legal action, I am going to initiate a formal performance improvement plan for Sarah. I will follow the procedure to the absolute letter. Every I dotted, every T crossed. We need to make sure there's an unimpeachable paper trail." Brenda smirked, clearly thinking he was just caving and trying to save face. "Fine," she said. "Do whatever you need to do, just make sure the outcome is the same." Oh, Dave was going to do what he needed to do, all right. First, Dave had to call Sarah into his office. This was the hardest part. He sat her down and explained the situation. He told her that HR was forcing his hand, but that he had a plan and he needed her to trust him and play along. Sarah, to her immense credit, saw the absurdity of it all and agreed. She was in. Phase 1 of the malicious compliance began. The PIP process required a formal initial counseling session with the employee and an HR representative present. Dave scheduled the meeting, and he came prepared. He had drafted a 10-page PIP document. The areas for improvement were works of absurdist corporate art, taken directly from Brenda's vague accusations. Goal 1. Employee must demonstrate a 15% increase in positive team synergy. How do you measure synergy? You don't, that was the point. Goal 2, proactively cultivate an enhanced collaborative atmosphere. Goal 3, reduce perceived negativity during non-project-based interactions. In the meeting, with Brenda sitting there smugly, Dave read out these goals to Sarah with an entirely straight face. Brenda's job was just to witness it, but the PIP policy stated HR must provide guidance on metrics for success. So Dave turned to Brenda. Brenda, could you please provide your professional input on the best KPIs we can use to track the cultivation of an enhanced collaborative atmosphere? Brenda just stammered. Well, just general attitude. Dave dutifully typed this down in the official meeting minutes. HR guidance on metrics, general attitude. Next came the weekly grind. The policy required the manager to keep a daily performance log and conduct a weekly review meeting with the employee. The minutes of this meeting had to be submitted to HR by 5 p.m. every Friday. Dave took this very, very seriously. He wrote epic novels. His daily logs for Sarah were filled with glowing, detailed accounts of her competence, all framed in the ridiculous language of the PIP. Monday, 10:17 a.m. Sarah exhibited proactive synergy by offering to help Mark from accounting with a spreadsheet formula. The collaborative atmosphere was palpably enhanced. Estimate a 5% synergy increase for this interaction alone. Wednesday, 2:30 p.m. During a team meeting, Sarah listened intently to others' opinions before offering her own, a clear demonstration of positive stakeholder engagement. No perceived negativity was observed. He would compile these notes into a 4 or 5-page, single-spaced report every single week and email the PDF to Brenda at 4:59 p.m. every Friday. The subject line was always the same. Mandatory PIP weekly progress reports, Sarah. Then came the training modules. The policy stated that any employee on a PIP must be assigned remedial training. Dave went into the company's online learning portal and assigned Sarah every single soft skills course he could find. Effective listening, advanced teamwork, email etiquette, leadership for non-leaders. There were 32 of them in total. Sarah, being the hyper-efficient person she was, knocked them all out in 3 days, scoring 100% on every quiz. Dave then triumphantly forwarded all 32 course completion certificates to Brenda in separate emails, with a note saying, "Just documenting Sarah's enthusiastic commitment to her performance improvement plan." Brenda's world was slowly becoming a living hell of Dave's making. Her inbox was a constant flood of his reports and certificates, but the real masterstroke was the bi-weekly manager HR sync-up. The policy demanded it. Dave scheduled these for 2 hours a pop. He would walk into Brenda's office with a 3-ring binder filled with his reports, charts he had made tracking Sarah's synergy score, and a long list of questions. "Brenda, thanks for your time," he'd start cheerfully. "I wanted to dive deep into the data from the last 2 weeks. As you can see on page 12, Sarah's collaborative atmosphere enhancement is trending up, but I'm concerned we're not seeing the same velocity on the perceived negativity reduction. I'd love to brainstorm with you on some new strategies we can deploy. Also, could you clarify Section 4, Paragraph B of the PIP manual regarding the definition of interpersonal friction?" Brenda was trapped. It was her job to oversee this. She had to sit there and listen to this nonsense. She couldn't tell him to stop because he was just doing his due diligence. Her own boss started noticing. Why was Brenda spending half her week in meetings about a single employee's PIP? Why was this one case generating an entire forest's worth of paperwork? The breaking point came about 6 weeks in. In their sync-up meeting, Dave pulled out a new chart he had made. Brenda just stared at it, her eye twitching. "Dave, this is insane," she finally snapped. "Nobody does this much for a PIP. You're supposed to just have a few meetings and then write them up." Dave put on his most concerned, innocent expression. "Brenda, I'm shocked you'd say that. You, of all people, know how important it is to follow procedure to the letter. You instructed me to handle this, and I'm simply ensuring the company is 100% protected. I would never want to be accused of cutting corners on something as serious as this." That was the kill shot. A week later, a company-wide email went out. Brenda had resigned, effective immediately, to pursue other opportunities. The PIP, now without its champion, was quietly forgotten. Dave's director called him in, curious about what happened. Dave just explained that Brenda had asked him to manage a performance issue, and he had used the approved corporate process to do so. The director, a savvy guy who knew Brenda's reputation, just grinned and told him, "Well done." Dave formally closed the PIP, writing in the final report that Sarah has successfully met and exceeded all performance goals and is now a model of synergistic collaboration. Then he took Sarah out for the most expensive steak lunch the company card would allow. She was never bothered by HR again, and a year later, she was promoted to team lead. Now that is what you call a good boss. In a corporate world that often feels transactional, where managers are just focused on their own climb up the ladder, Dave stands out as a true leader. He had every reason to take the easy way out, to fire Sarah, complain about it privately, and move on. It would have saved him a ton of work and personal risk. But he didn't. He recognized his responsibility wasn't just to the company's bottom line, but to the people who did the actual work. The pure, poetic justice of this story is how he turned the weapon of bureaucracy back on its wielder. The HR rep, who lived and breathed by arcane rules and processes, was utterly unprepared for someone to actually follow those rules with the maniacal precision she demanded of others. She wanted to use the system to execute a personal vendetta, and Dave forced her to live in that system until it suffocated her. It's a brilliant case of malicious compliance being used not for personal gain, but as a shield to protect the innocent. Our next story takes us into a slightly different arena, one with its own special ironclad set of rules, a union shop. Now, for anyone who hasn't worked in a unionized environment, you have to understand that the union contract, or the collective bargaining agreement, is everything. It's not a handbook of suggestions. It's a legally binding document that governs every aspect of the job, from pay rates and break times to, most importantly, the disciplinary process. Most managers in these environments learn to respect the contract. But every now and then, you get a new boss who thinks he's a cowboy, ready to clean up the town. This is the story of one such manager and the seasoned union worker who taught him that in a union shop, the contract is the law, and he was the expert lawyer. Let's call our protagonist Mike. Mike was a mechanic at a large industrial plant, and he'd been there for the better part of 15 years. He was good with his hands, knew the machinery like the back of his hand, and was a proud union member. More than that, he was a student of the contract. He'd read it cover to cover, not just once, but dozens of times. He knew the articles, the sections, the subclauses. He understood that the contract was the only thing that stood between the workers and the whims of management. The trouble started when a new supervisor, a guy named Gary, was promoted to run his section. Gary was young, ambitious, and had a chip on his shoulder. He'd been a manager at a non-union facility before, and he saw the union and its rules as nothing but a frustrating obstacle to his vision of efficiency. He wanted to be the guy who finally tamed the union guys and made a name for himself. From the start, Gary and Mike clashed, but always in a low-key, professional way. Gary would try to get workers to skip their designated breaks to finish a job early. Mike would politely say, "Actually, Gary, Article 15, Section 4 guarantees us that break, and the guys need it to stay safe." Gary would try to change someone's shift without the required 48-hour notice. Mike would calmly point him to the relevant clause in the contract. Mike wasn't being a troublemaker. He was just enforcing the rules that everyone had agreed to play by. But in Gary's eyes, Mike was a roadblock, a symbol of the union's power that he was desperate to break. So, he decided Mike had to go. All Gary needed was a pretext, and eventually he got a flimsy one. One afternoon, Mike was 5 minutes late returning from his afternoon break. Gary was waiting for him, tapping his foot with a furious look on his face. What Gary didn't know, or didn't care to know, was that Mike had been stopped by a new hire who was struggling with a jammed piece of equipment. Mike had taken those 5 minutes to help the kid out, preventing a costly maintenance call and a potential safety issue. To Gary, this was the golden opportunity. He saw a violation and he pounced. He immediately told Mike to follow him to the office. "You're done, Mike," Gary said with a triumphant sneer as soon as the door was closed. "That's time theft and insubordination. Pack your things. You're fired." He said it with such finality, as if his words alone were enough to make it true. He leaned back in his chair, expecting Mike to either beg for his job or explode in anger. Instead, Mike just stood there with a calm, almost bored expression on his face. After a moment of silence, Mike spoke, his voice steady. "Gary, I'm afraid this meeting is not valid." Gary's smirk vanished. "What did you say?" "I said this meeting is not valid," Mike repeated. "And I am not fired. According to Article 22, Section 2 of our collective bargaining agreement, any disciplinary meeting which could reasonably be expected to result in termination requires the presence of a union steward. As I look around the room, I don't see my steward, Tom. So this conversation is over." Gary was stunned into silence. He clearly had no idea what Mike was talking about. Mike wasn't finished. "Furthermore, Gary, the contract mandates a 4-step progressive discipline process. Step 1 is a verbal warning. Step 2 is a written warning. Step 3 is a suspension. And Step 4 is termination. To my knowledge, I have a clean record. You can't just jump to Step 4 because you feel like it. So, I'll be returning to the floor now. If you'd like to properly schedule a Step 1 meeting with my steward present, feel free to do so." Mike turned and walked out of the office, leaving Gary sitting there with his mouth hanging open, utterly humiliated. The first shot had been fired, and Gary had completely missed. A few days later, Gary, having been forced to actually read the contract by a furious HR manager, scheduled the official Step 1 meeting. Mike was there, and so was his union steward, Tom, a calm, older guy who had seen 100 managers like Gary come and go. Gary laid out his case. Mike was 5 minutes late from break. "This is a formal verbal warning for time theft," he declared. Tom, the steward, spoke up. "Okay, Gary. According to Article 23, the Just Cause provision, management is required to conduct a full and fair investigation before issuing discipline. Did you investigate why Mike was late?" "That's irrelevant," Gary snapped. "He was late." "On the contrary, it's entirely relevant," Mike said. "I was assisting a new employee, name of Kevin, with a jam on the number 3 conveyor which prevented a shutdown. Did you speak to Kevin?" Gary's face flushed. Of course he hadn't. He hadn't investigated anything. The verbal warning was issued, but Tom made sure a formal union objection was attached to the record, citing an incomplete investigation. Gary had won the battle, but it was a hollow victory, and the war was just beginning. Gary was now obsessed. He started following Mike, watching his every move, just waiting for a mistake. About a week later, he thought he had won. He saw Mike use a specialized torque wrench and then return it to the tool cage. Gary marched over to the cage, checked the sign-out sheet, and saw that Mike had forgotten to sign it back in. "Aha! Violation of tool control policy," he thought. He immediately wrote up a Step 2 written warning and called another meeting. This time, he walked in full of confidence. "Mike, you violated safety and inventory policy. You failed to sign a tool back in. This is your written warning." Mike and Tom listened patiently. When Gary was finished, Mike slid a small, grease-stained notebook across the table. "What's this?" Gary asked. "That's my personal maintenance log," Mike said. "As you can see, I noted the time I took the wrench, 10:35 a.m., and the time I returned it, 10:52 a.m. I also noted that the official sign-in sheet was out of ink. I even made a note to report the faulty pen to the shift foreman." Now, the security camera directly above the tool cage has a clear shot of the sign-out desk. The time-stamped footage will confirm that I attempted to sign the tool in, found the pen dry, and placed the tool securely back in its cradle. Shall we ask security to pull the tape for us? Per Article 23, you are required to consider all exculpatory evidence. Gary's face went from red to white. He was caught. He had an employee on a safety violation that was completely fabricated because he was too lazy to do a basic check. He was forced to withdraw the written warning in front of the union steward. He was now 0 for 2, and he looked like a fool. But his obsession was too deep. He spent the next 2 weeks shadowing Mike like a hawk. Finally, he got him. He saw Mike, while working on a platform, momentarily place a wrench on the safety railing next to him while he reached for another tool. It was a minor infraction, a habit many of the mechanics had, but it was technically against the rules. A housekeeping violation. Gary practically sprinted to his office to write up the Step 3 disciplinary action, which would come with a 3-day suspension. He called the meeting, and this time he could barely contain his glee. "I saw you with my own 2 eyes," he proclaimed. "You placed a tool on a safety railing, creating a potential falling object hazard. This is a Step 3 violation. You are suspended for 3 days without pay." He leaned back, sure he had finally won. Then Tom, the steward, spoke up in a quiet voice. "Gary, you say you saw this happen." "Yes, I did," Gary said proudly. "And as the direct supervisor on the scene," Tom continued, "did you immediately correct the unsafe behavior and instruct Mike to move the tool to his belt, as required by the company's own health and safety policy, Volume 2, Section 8, Supervisor Responsibilities?" The room went silent. Gary's smile evaporated. He had been so excited to finally catch Mike, so focused on running back to his office to write the ticket, that he hadn't done the first and most basic duty of a supervisor: ensure a safe work environment. He hadn't corrected the behavior. He had just used it. He had allowed an unsafe condition to persist so he could punish an employee. In that moment, the entire disciplinary action collapsed. Not only was the suspension thrown out, but Gary himself was now on the hook for violating a major safety policy. The whole ordeal had now dragged on for over a month. Gary had spent countless hours trying to fire Mike, and all he had to show for it was a stack of failed disciplinary actions and his own safety violation. The plant manager got involved. An investigation was launched, not into Mike, but into Gary for targeted employee harassment. The union filed a formal grievance, using Gary's own paperwork as the primary evidence against him. A week later, the news came down. Gary was being demoted and transferred to a warehouse on the other side of the state. He was gone. Mike never even got a successful verbal warning. He had taken on a manager who tried to fire him, and without ever raising his voice, used the manager's own ignorance of the rules to get him removed instead. There's a special kind of satisfaction that comes from watching someone who thinks they are a predator walk right into a perfectly set trap. That's exactly what Mike did. Gary, the manager, was operating on pure ego. He saw the rulebook, the union contract, as an annoyance to be ignored. Mike, on the other hand, treated it like a sacred text. He understood that every single word in that document was the result of a negotiation, a past fight that someone else had already won for him. What makes this story a masterclass is Mike's incredible discipline. He never lost his cool. He never got emotional. He just calmly and systematically dismantled his manager's case, piece by piece, using the manager's own procedural failures as his weapon. He let Gary's arrogance and laziness do all the work. It's the ultimate proof that in a structured environment, the person who has done the reading will always have the upper hand on the person who is just trying to wing it. Gary thought he was the boss, but Mike proved that the contract was the real authority in the room. So far, we've seen stories about overzealous directors and petty managers. But what happens when the person trying to fire you is way up the food chain? What happens when it's a vice president, a corporate Goliath with a corner office and the ear of the CEO? You'd think the fight would be over before it even began. But our next story is about an employee who, when faced with an illegal termination from a powerful executive, realized that the bigger they are, the harder they fall. Especially when they fall into a pit that they, and the company they work for, dug themselves. This isn't just about saving a job. This is about turning the company's entire internal justice system against one of its own powerful leaders. Let's call our main character Alex. Alex worked in the analytics department of a large tech company. He was the kind of employee every company needs: smart, reliable, and meticulous. He wasn't a rock star. He didn't give flashy presentations, but his data was always clean, his reports were always accurate, and the sales team relied on his work to make their decisions. He'd been with the company for about 5 years and had a file full of positive performance reviews. He was, by all accounts, a model employee. The problem began with the arrival of a new VP of sales, a woman named Diana. Diana was a classic disruptor executive, brought in from the outside to shake things up. She was charismatic, incredibly ambitious, and had a reputation for being utterly ruthless. She saw the existing departments not as teams to be nurtured, but as chess pieces to be moved around or swept off the board to suit her strategy. And unfortunately for Alex, his role was sitting on a square that Diana wanted for one of her own pieces. She had a favorite analyst from her last company that she was determined to bring in, and Alex was in the way. Since Alex had a perfect performance record, Diana couldn't fire him for cause. And going through the formal layoff process would involve a lot of red tape, severance negotiations, and questions from HR. Diana decided she was too important for all that. She was a vice president. The rules were for little people. She was going to solve this problem with brute force. She called Alex into her office late on a Friday afternoon. It was a classic ambush. There was no one else there, no HR rep, not even her assistant. Her office was huge, with a panoramic view of the city, clearly designed to intimidate. "Alex, have a seat," she said, though her tone made it clear it wasn't a friendly chat. She didn't waste any time. "Look, I'm going to be direct. Your role on this team isn't working out with the new direction I'm taking things. We're eliminating the position, effective immediately." Alex was completely blindsided. "What? My position is being eliminated? I just submitted my quarterly projections yesterday." Diana waved a dismissive hand. "Things change fast. Security will escort you to your desk to collect your personal belongings. HR will mail you your final paycheck. It's been a pleasure." And that was it. No reason, no warning, no severance discussion. Just a corporate execution. Alex was in a state of shock. He was marched to his desk by a stone-faced security guard, forced to pack his photos and his favorite mug into a cardboard box in front of all his colleagues. It was a walk of shame, designed to be as humiliating as possible. He went home that night feeling numb. The sheer injustice of it was staggering. He had given 5 years of good work to this company, and he was thrown out like a piece of trash because a new VP wanted to hire her friend. He was angry, he was scared, and he felt completely powerless. He thought about calling a lawyer, but he knew that would be a long, expensive fight. Then, as he sat there stewing, a thought occurred to him. A few months earlier, HR had made everyone digitally sign the new, updated 150-page employee handbook. Alex, being the meticulous guy he was, had actually downloaded a copy to his personal cloud drive, just in case. This, he realized, was just in case. He poured himself a stiff drink, opened his laptop, and started to read. He didn't just skim it. He read every single word, from the welcome message from the CEO to the fine print on expense reports. He paid special attention to the chapters on termination of employment, internal grievance procedures, and corporate code of conduct. And there, in the dry, boring corporate language, he found his ammunition. Section 7.2. All involuntary terminations must be conducted by the employee's direct manager in the presence of a designated HR business partner. Diana had violated that. Section 7.4. Termination for cause requires a documented history of progressive discipline, including verbal warnings, written warnings, and a performance improvement plan. Alex had a spotless record. Section 7.5. Termination due to position elimination or restructuring requires formal approval from the divisional head and the Chief Human Resources Officer at least 30 days in advance, and a legally reviewed severance package must be offered. Diana had clearly violated that. And then he found the kill shot in the Code of Conduct, Article 4. All officers of the company are required to act with the highest degree of integrity and are subject to immediate termination for knowingly violating established company policy. Diana hadn't just fired him improperly. She, a vice president, had knowingly violated multiple foundational company policies. She hadn't just exposed the company to a lawsuit. She had broken their own corporate laws. Alex didn't sleep that night. He spent hours drafting an email. It was calm, professional, and devastating. He didn't write it like a victim. He wrote it like an auditor reporting a critical failure in the system. The "to" line was crucial. He didn't send it to Diana. He sent it to the three people Diana couldn't control: the Chief Human Resources Officer, the company's general counsel, and the anonymous corporate compliance email address that was meant for reporting ethical violations. The subject line was cold and precise: formal report of procedural violations and unethical conduct in termination attempt. In the body of the email, he laid out the timeline of events factually and without emotion. Then he created a numbered list. 1. On Friday at 4:30 p.m., I was informed by VP Diana that my position was terminated. This was in violation of Section 7.2, which requires an HR partner to be present. 2. No documentation for poor performance was ever provided, in violation of Section 7.4. 3. This action appears to be a direct violation of the Code of Conduct, Article 4. He went on, quoting each policy she had broken, chapter and verse. He concluded the email by saying, "As per the Internal Grievance Policy, Section 9, I am formally requesting an immediate investigation into this matter. For your reference, I have attached my last 3 annual performance reviews, all of which are rated exceeds expectations." He hit send at 7:00 a.m. on Saturday morning. On Monday, the corporate machine kicked into high gear. An email like that sent to legal and compliance bypasses the normal chain of command. It triggers alarms. It's not a disgruntled employee complaint anymore. It's a formal internal investigation. And the target wasn't Alex, it was Diana. The investigators from legal and HR immediately put a hold on Diana's email account and seized her corporate calendar. They interviewed the security guard who escorted Alex out. They interviewed Alex's direct manager, who was furious because he hadn't even been told his own employee was being fired. They confidentially interviewed other members of the sales team. Alex was called in on Tuesday for a formal interview with the company's top lawyer and the head of HR. He brought his notes and calmly walked them through the events, just as he had in his email. They listened intently, their faces grim. The investigation uncovered everything. They found emails between Diana and her friend from her old company, discussing the role and salary weeks before she had even spoken to Alex. They found that she had lied to her boss, the executive VP, claiming Alex had performance issues. The evidence was overwhelming. Diana hadn't just bent the rules. She had engaged in a premeditated, deceptive, and unethical act that put the company at massive legal risk. 1 week after Alex sent his email, a quiet, bland memo went out to all staff. Diana had resigned to pursue other opportunities. She was gone. Her corner office was empty. The head of HR called Alex personally. He apologized profusely on behalf of the company and offered Alex his job back, with full back pay and a promotion. Alex thought about it for a minute. He could go back, but the trust was broken. He had a better idea. "Thank you, I appreciate that," Alex said calmly. but I think it's best for both parties if we separate permanently. My lawyer will be in touch to discuss the terms of a separation agreement." With the company now facing a mountain of evidence that one of its top officers had fired him illegally, Alex held all the cards. His lawyer negotiated a severance package that was astronomically larger than anything he would have received in a standard layoff. He got a full year's salary, a massive bonus, extended health benefits, and a formal apology. He walked away a wealthy man, all because a VP thought she was above the rules, and he was the one guy who had bothered to read them. That story is on a whole other level. This wasn't just malicious compliance. This was a corporate coup. What's so incredible is the presence of mind Alex had. Most people in that situation would be reeling, panicking, thinking about how they're going to pay their rent. And he did feel all that, but he channeled it into a cold, methodical strategy. The single most important decision he made was to go home and read the handbook. In that moment of crisis, he chose research over rage. And his execution was flawless. He didn't send an angry email to Diana. He didn't post on social media. He sent a calm, factual, and legally devastating report to the exact people in the company whose entire job is to deal with rogue executives like Diana. He essentially filed a bug report for a critical flaw in the management chain, and the system, designed to protect itself, had no choice but to debug the problem. And the problem was a vice president. It's the ultimate example of an employee using the company's own immune system to target a cancer in its leadership. All right, for our final story, we have a tale that combines the slow-burn frustration of our first story with the meticulous documentation of our last one. This is about a boss who thought firing someone was a simple, one-step action, like flipping a switch. He was about to learn that he hadn't flipped a switch. He had pulled the pin on a bureaucratic grenade, and the employee was about to make him hold it for as long as humanly possible. This isn't just about avoiding being fired. It's about forcing your opponent to go through every single painful, tedious, and humiliating step of a process they are completely unprepared for. Welcome to the 7 circles of HR hell. Our narrator, we'll call him Ben, was a senior project manager at a trendy marketing agency. He was good at his job because he was organized, detail-oriented, and believed in process. His boss, Carl, was the exact opposite. Carl was a stereotypical ideas guy. He was loud, chaotic, loved grand pronouncements, and absolutely loathed details, paperwork, and anything that smelled of process. He managed by impulse and gut feeling, which meant his team was in a constant state of firefighting the crises he created. Ben, with his methodical checklists and carefully planned timelines, was a constant, low-level irritant to Carl's chaotic style. Carl wanted a team of yes-men who would jump from one half-baked idea to the next. Ben was the guy who would raise his hand and say, "That's a great idea, Carl, but have we thought about the budget and the timeline?" So, Carl decided Ben had to go. Like the other bosses in our stories, Carl opted for the ambush. He called Ben into his office one afternoon, closed the door, and got straight to it. "Ben," he said, trying to sound firm and decisive, "your time with us is over. Today is your last day. It's just not a good fit. We're moving in a different direction." He started talking about getting his personal items, as if the conversation was already finished. Ben just sat there and listened. He didn't look shocked or angry. When Carl was done, Ben simply nodded. "Okay, Carl, I understand," he said calmly. "Just for the record, which step of the company's official disciplinary and termination process is this?" Carl looked at him like he had just started speaking another language. "What are you talking about? What process? I just told you you're fired." Ben reached into his work bag and pulled out a slim, spiral-bound booklet. It was the employee handbook. Well, according to this handbook, which we all had to sign on our first day, termination is the final step of a multi-stage process. It starts with a verbal warning, then a written one, then a mandatory performance plan. We can't just skip all that. I'm happy to cooperate with the process, Carl, but we do have to follow it. Carl was speechless. He was used to people being intimidated by him. He grabbed the handbook from Ben, furiously flipped through it, and then made a frantic call to HR. The muffled sounds of his angry conversation were punctuated by long, defeated pauses. Finally, he hung up the phone, his face a deep shade of crimson. "Fine," he hissed. "We'll do your stupid process." The gates of bureaucratic hell had been opened. Circle 1, the verbal warning. A few days later, Carl was forced to schedule a formal verbal warning meeting. He had to come up with a reason, so he chose the vaguest one he could think of: a general lack of proactivity. In the meeting, Ben sat with a notepad and pen, taking meticulous notes. "Okay, Carl," Ben said politely. "Could you please provide me with 3 specific, documented instances from the last quarter where I failed to be proactive? It will help me understand the expectation and improve." Carl, of course, had nothing. He just stammered about a vibe and a general feeling. Ben wrote it all down. The official verbal warning was on his record, but it was based on nothing. Circle 2, the written warning. 2 weeks later, Carl had to escalate. He presented Ben with a formal written warning letter, doubling down on the vague nonsense about attitude and not fitting the company's dynamic culture. Ben took the letter, and the next day he submitted a formal 5-page rebuttal. For every vague point Carl made, Ben provided a counterpoint with hard evidence. To rebut the lack of initiative claim, he attached an email chain where he had proposed a new, more efficient workflow. To rebut the poor attitude claim, he attached kudos from 3 different clients. He sent his rebuttal to Carl, and he made sure to CC the head of HR. The paper trail was growing. Circle 3, the performance improvement plan. Now came the part Carl dreaded most: paperwork. He had to create a 30-day PIP for Ben. Carl, who could barely write a coherent email, dashed off a 1-page document filled with meaningless corporate jargon and impossible goals. One goal was literally demonstrate a paradigm shift in creative synergy. Another was completely re-architect the client intake process. It was designed to be impossible to achieve. But Ben received it with the utmost seriousness. Circle 4, the weekly check-ins. The PIP policy required weekly one-on-one meetings to review progress. These meetings became Ben's stage for masterful torture. He would come to each meeting with a detailed agenda and a list of questions. "Morning, Carl. Let's discuss the paradigm shift in synergy. I've broken it down into 5 key deliverables. To start, could you please define the parameters of the paradigm we're shifting from?" Carl would just stare blankly. Ben would then document in his official meeting minutes, which he dutifully emailed to HR every week. Management was unable to provide clarification on the core objectives of the PIP. Circle 5, malicious compliance. While tormenting Carl in meetings, Ben was a model employee. He did his actual job perfectly, and he started tackling the PIP goals with absurd literalism. For the goal to re-architect the client intake process, he spent 2 weeks interviewing every person in the company, creating complex flow charts, and produced a 50-page proposal for a new system. It was brilliant, thorough, and something Carl absolutely did not have the time or patience to read, let alone implement. But Ben had done it. He had delivered. Circle 6, the final review. At the end of the 30 days, the final review meeting was held, with a now very interested HR manager in attendance. Carl came in, ready to declare the PIP a failure and finally fire Ben. But before he could speak, Ben stood up and started a PowerPoint presentation he had prepared. For 20 minutes, he went through every single goal on the PIP, even the absurd ones, and demonstrated with meticulous documentation, charts, and evidence how he had successfully met or exceeded every single one. When he finished, he looked at Carl and the HR manager and said, "I believe I have successfully completed the performance improvement plan. I look forward to continuing to apply these learnings in my role." The HR manager was visibly stunned. Carl just sat there, defeated. He had no move left. Circle 7, the surrender. The company was now in a legal nightmare. They had an employee who they had tried to fire, but who now had a mountain of evidence proving he was a stellar performer who had successfully navigated their entire disciplinary process. Firing him now would be an open and shut wrongful termination lawsuit. A week later, Ben was called into one last meeting. This time, it was just the HR manager and a lawyer. Carl was nowhere to be seen. The tone was no longer hostile, it was desperate. They offered him a generous severance package, a glowing letter of recommendation, and his full bonus if he would sign a non-disclosure agreement and resign voluntarily. Ben, who had already accepted a new, better-paying job during the second week of his PIP, graciously accepted their offer. He had spent the last 2 months getting paid to professionally torment the boss who tried to unjustly fire him, all while securing his next career move. He walked out of that company with a huge check and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that he had forced his enemy to march through every single circle of the bureaucratic hell he had created. And there you have it. 5 incredible stories of employees who were pushed to the edge and decided to push back, not with anger but with the company's own rulebook. What we see in all these stories is that knowledge is truly power. Whether it's an 800-page government contract, a union agreement, or a dusty employee handbook, the rules are there for a reason. And while they're often designed to protect the company, a smart employee can turn them into a shield, and sometimes a very effective sword. It's the ultimate form of professional self-defense, burying your enemies under a mountain of their own paperwork. So, what do you think? Have you ever had to use a company's own rules against them? We'd love to hear your story in the comments below. And if you enjoyed these tales of procedural revenge, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another video. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.